In the heart of a forgotten minefield, Ilara and her children had turned a colossal water tower into their last refuge. Each night was a battle against swarms of hungry pests, and each day a fight for survival. But Ilara didn't know that, within the rusted metal walls, a green hope awaited them. The faint light of the lantern trembled in Ilara's hands, dancing over the surface of a hidden chamber, revealing a series of hermetically sealed containers. They weren't the tools or water she expected, but something far more precious. Her heart pounded against the rusted metal ribs of her refuge, an echo of the pulse of hope that had suddenly ignited within her. With trembling fingers, she opened the first container. Inside, wrapped in an almost transparent fabric, were seeds, small, dark, yet with an almost ethereal glow. A soft scent of damp earth and something sweet like wild honey emanated from them. Curiosity and disbelief collided within her. Seeds? In such a desolate place, a treasure of life. Beside the containers, a worn diary, sealed against moisture, held notes in an ancient but legible script. Ilara opened it, and accumulated dust exhaled a dry sigh into the stagnant air of the chamber. The pages, yellowed by time, told the story of a desperate project. They spoke of genetic engineering, of seeds enhanced to withstand impoverished soils, prolonged droughts, and most importantly, to repel the pests that infested the outside world. A promise of abundant harvests, of healed soil, of peace against the nocturnal swarms. The project's name, Green Genesis, was etched onto the diary's cover. The irony cut Ilara. A new beginning, hidden in the heart of an end. The night's silence, previously filled only by the distant rustle of the wind and the persistent scratching of creatures outside, now seemed to amplify the magnitude of the discovery. The seeds appeared to glow, each a minuscule point of light in the vast darkness of her existence. A shiver ran down her spine, not from cold, but from an emotion she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was an almost overwhelming sensation, threatening to crumble the walls of resilience she had built around herself. Her eyes filled with tears, silent and warm, tracing paths down her dirty cheeks. She carefully closed the diary and the containers, protecting the treasure as if they were her own children. She couldn't wake Kyle and Leah yet. They slept soundly, their small bodies nestled in worn blankets, oblivious to the miracle their mother had just found. The promise of food, of a future without the constant threat of hunger and pests, was something Ilara needed to process alone for a moment. The weight of responsibility, however, came hand in hand with hope. How would she plant these seeds? The soil outside was a field of death, dotted with forgotten mines, each step a calculated risk. The water tower was a refuge, but also a prison. The vision of a verdant field sprouting from the desolate earth seemed an impossible dream. Ilara sealed the crevice with a piece of rusted metal, ensuring the chamber remained hidden again. With the diary and a small handful of seeds carefully tucked into her pocket, she crawled back to the main section of the water tower. The creak of metal under her weight was a familiar, comforting sound. She nestled among her children, embracing them with renewed strength. It was still dawn. The desert outside sighed with the wind, and the faint scratching of pests' claws on the metal wall reminded her of the relentless reality. But now, beneath the tower's cold metal, a faint warmth had begun to grow. Ilara closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind buzzed with plans, with the image of green shoots breaking through the arid earth, with the promise of a tomorrow where despair would no longer be the only sustenance. Hope, a fragile sprout, had finally found a place to take root. The first rays of sun filtered through the water tower's crevices, painting pale stripes in the darkness. Ilara opened her eyes, her body aching but her mind strangely alert. Hope, fragile as a newborn sprout, still trembled within her. Refusing to be suffocated by the cold reality of metal and sand, the small handful of seeds in her pocket seemed to burn against her thigh, a constant reminder of the life dormant within them. She stood up, her knees cracking. The smell of rusted metal and dust mingled with the sweet, innocent breath of Kale and Leah, who still slept deeply. Ilara watched them, their childlike faces marked by hunger disguised in dreams. A future without the nocturnal torment of insects, without empty stomachs, seemed almost sacrilegious in its impossibility. But the seeds were real, and the diary a promise. The first task was the most urgent: to understand. Ilara pulled the diary from her pocket, its rough cover beneath her fingers. In the faint light of dawn, she began to read, turning the yellowed pages with the care of someone handling an ancient scroll. The notes were meticulous, written by a Dr. Aris Thorne, the visionary behind the Green Genesis project. He detailed not only the creation of the seeds, but also cultivation methods for extreme conditions. He spoke of a special nutritive substrate, a precise watering regimen, and how the plants, once mature, would release natural compounds that would ward off pests and gradually enrich the soil. "These seeds," he had written on a crossed-out page, "are more than food. They are the cure for a dying earth, the weapon against the darkness that consumes us." The most crucial part, however, came with a warning. Initial germination is delicate. It requires a controlled environment and maximum protection against contaminants and environmental shocks. The first harvests are the most precious, for from them will come the seeds that will truly repopulate the world. A controlled environment. Ilara looked around her metal home. The water tower was a refuge, yes, but it was far from a laboratory. And outside lay the silent death of the minefield. She felt a knot tighten in her throat. How could she protect something so fragile in such a hostile world? Kyle stirred, his brown eyes blinking open. "Mama, is it daytime already?" His voice was rough with sleep. Leah, who had been nestled in her brother's arm, also stirred, her blue eyes watching Ilara with the same childlike curiosity. Ilara quickly hid the diary, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Yes, my loves, it's daytime." She couldn't tell them about the seeds yet, not until she had a plan. Hope was a luxury they couldn't afford if it proved false. During their meager breakfast, a piece of dry bread and a few sips of rationed water, Ilara pondered. A controlled environment. Where? The secret chamber? It could be, but it was too small for significant cultivation. And what if it failed? She couldn't risk all the seeds there. Her eyes scanned the interior of the water tower, the metal walls, the packed earth floor. There wasn't a single corner that could be considered controlled, unless... A small, daring idea began to form. She remembered some old, rusted metal buckets they had found near the water tower, now used to collect rainwater when it rained. And there was a corner, in the lowest and most sheltered part of the refuge, where sunlight entered in a limited but constant way through a crack at the top. There was still the problem of the nutritive substrate. Thorne's diary mentioned a specific composition of soil and minerals. Ilara had nothing like it, but she had the desert earth, impoverished, yes, but perhaps the seeds truly were as resilient as Dr. Thorne claimed. She made a decision. She would start small, a test, 1 bucket, a little of the earth from inside, and a few seeds. "Kyle, Leah," she called, her voice a little firmer than usual. "We're going to make a garden." The children's eyes widened. A garden. The idea was as absurd as it was magical. They had never seen a real garden, only the dried, dead plants of the desert. "But Mama," Leah asked, her small lips pursed, "where will we plant?" Ilara smiled, a spark of determination in her gaze. "Right here. We'll have our own patch of green, right here in our metal home." The children's surprise soon turned into contained excitement. Kyle, the elder, went to fetch one of the buckets. The metal scraped against the dirt floor, a harsh sound. Leah found an old metal spade, small for her hands, but which she held with pride. Ilara guided them to the corner she had chosen. Together, they scraped the dry earth from the water tower's floor, filling the bucket with what seemed to be just dust and small pebbles. Ilara knew it wasn't ideal, but it was all they had. With steady hands, she took 3 of the darkest, most luminous seeds from her pocket. They were minuscule, but in each, Ilara saw the promise of an entire forest. With trembling fingers, she made 3 small holes in the bucket's earth and deposited a seed in each, covering them gently. Kyle and Leah watched her in reverent silence. The water, rationed with such care, would now be used for something more than just quenching thirst. Ilara poured a thin stream over the newly planted earth, the sound of drops falling onto the dry soil almost a sacred whisper. "Now," Ilara said, looking at her children, "we wait, and we care for them." She knew the journey would be long and uncertain. The possibility of failure was overwhelming. But as the sun rose in the desert sky, warming the water tower's metal, Ilara felt that for the first time in a long time, they weren't just waiting to survive, they were waiting to live. The smell of damp earth, even if from a simple bucket, was a balm to her weary soul, a harbinger of a green tomorrow. The following days dragged on in a cadence of hope and anxiety. Ilara spent most of her time observing the bucket, as if her attention alone could force life to sprout. Each morning, even before the first rays of sun painted the sandy floor, she was there, crouched, scrutinizing the damp earth. Kyle and Leah, infected by their mother's reverent stillness, also drew near, their childlike faces filled with silent curiosity. "Mama, when will it grow?" Leah asked softly, pointing with a tiny finger at the brown surface. "Soon, my love," Ilara replied, her voice a whisper. "We have to be patient." Patience was a virtue the desert had cruelly taught the family. But this time, there was a different intensity to the wait, a promise that made every second eternal. The wind howled outside, scraping against the metal carcass of the water tower, a constant reminder of the desolation that surrounded them. At night, the persistent scratching of pests on the walls reinforced the urgency of hope. On the 4th day, something changed. Ilara was inspecting the bucket, the faint light from the crevice above revealing every grain of sand, when her eyes caught a pale green speck. It was minuscule, almost imperceptible, a sliver of life breaking through the dry crust. A shiver ran through her body. It couldn't be, but it was. There it stood, a thin stem, timidly bending towards the light. A sob escaped her throat, a sound she had suppressed for years. Warm tears streamed down her cheeks, but this time they weren't of sadness or despair, but of a relief so profound it made her tremble. "Kyle! Leah!" she called, her voice choked with emotion. "Come see!" The two ran, their footsteps echoing on the metal. Their eyes widened at the sight of the small sprout. "It's a plant!" Kyle exclaimed, the surprise in his childlike voice mixed with genuine fascination. Leah knelt, her face almost touching the sprout. "It's so tiny!" Ilara smiled, a genuine smile that had not graced her face in a long time. That small sprout, fragile and vulnerable, was a miracle. It was proof. Thorne's diary had not lied. The seeds were indeed the promise of life. Caring for the sprout became the family's new ritual. Ilara watered it with precise drops of rationed water, protecting it with a piece of cloth during the hottest hours of the day. She read and reread Dr. Thorne's notes on initial germination and the nutritive substrate. The sprout grew slowly, but with impressive tenacity. A second and a third sprout also emerged, fragile, but alive. However, as the sprouts stretched a little further, Ilara noticed a problem. The green was pale, almost yellowish. The leaves, though present, seemed too thin. The desert soil, even with water, was insufficient. The diary was clear. Initial germination is delicate. The first harvests are the most precious, for from them will come the seeds that will truly repopulate the world. And crucially, the nutritive substrate is vital for the full development of genetic qualities. Hope, once a vibrant sun, was now obscured by a new shadow. She had the sprouts, but they were languishing. She needed better soil, nutrients that the dry floor of the water tower couldn't offer. They scoured the interior of the water tower once more, searching for anything, any residue, any trace that might be useful. The rusted metal, the dust accumulated in the corners, the few objects they had collected over the years, nothing seemed helpful. Until, in a darker corner, near the base of the curved wall, Ilara noticed something different. A thicker layer of debris, a mix of fine sand, and what appeared to be fragments of decomposed organic material. It could have been remnants of leaves or insects that the wind had deposited there before the water tower was completely sealed, or perhaps an accumulation of dust and elements brought by rare rains over decades. It was a darker, denser substance than the packed earth of the floor. With Leah's old spade, Ilara began to carefully scrape. The metallic sound scratched the silence. With each scrape, a small amount of that material came loose. It was little, very little, but it was different. It had a more earthy, less sandy smell, and the texture seemed richer. The flame of hope ignited again, now with a new strategy. She couldn't go into the minefield in search of soil, but perhaps the refuge itself harbored a smaller secret, a tiny deposit of forgotten nutrients. If that material was the nutritive substrate Dr. Thorne mentioned, even in a small amount, it could be the key to strengthening her sprouts and ensuring the promise of green genesis truly bloomed. Ilara continued to scrape, the sharp sound of the spade against the metal echoing in the carcass. Each handful of that dark material was kept with the reverence of a treasure. It wasn't much, perhaps enough to fill a cup, but the density and earthy smell were undeniable. Carefully, she transported it near the bucket where the pale sprouts struggled for life. Kale and Leah approached, their childlike gazes fixed on their mother, then on the dark material, and finally on the wilting sprouts. The fascination on their faces was palpable. "What is it, Mama?" Leah asked, her voice a whisper. "It's food for our plants, my love," Ilara replied, her voice calm but filled with new hope, something to make them strong. With her fingertips, Ilara delicately mixed the new substrate with the sandy earth around the small sprouts. She knew she shouldn't be too invasive, that the life there was fragile. With each movement, she felt the pulse of her own hope, an accelerated beat in her chest. Then, with the precision that water scarcity demanded, she watered the sprouts again, watching the water penetrate the now darker mixture. The following days were a new test of patience. Anxiety was a sharp knife in Ilara's chest. She watched the sprouts with an almost painful intensity. Kyle and Leah, sensing their mother's tension, also became silent guardians of the small garden. On the third day after the new substrate was added, Ilara noticed the first change. The stems of the sprouts, previously thin and almost transparent, seemed to have gained a greener hue. It wasn't a vibrant green yet, but the yellowish pallor was beginning to recede. She leaned closer, almost touching the minuscule leaves. Yes, they were a little firmer, a little more robust. The next day, the transformation was undeniable. The green deepened, the leaves opened a little more, turning with a new thirst for light towards the crevice in the ceiling. The sprouts had stopped wilting. They were growing slowly, but with a vitality they hadn't possessed before. A smile, previously a mere sketch, bloomed on Ilara's face. "Look, my loves!" she exclaimed, her voice choked with joy. "They're getting strong!" Kyle and Leah knelt, their eyes shining. "They're really growing," Kyle said, marveling. Leah extended a finger, almost touching a leaf, but stopped, as if fearing to break the spell. That small bucket, once a desperate experiment, was now a sanctuary of life. Dr. Thorne had not lied. The nutritive substrate was indeed the key. The promise of green genesis, which had seemed so distant and unattainable, now manifested there, small but resilient. Right in the heart of their metal refuge, a new wave of determination surged through Ilara. They needed more, not just 3 sprouts, but a garden, a field, an oasis. The vision of a green world, free from pests and hunger, became clearer in her mind. But for that, they needed more substrate, much more. Her eyes swept the interior of the water tower again, with a renewed perspective. That small deposit in the corner was almost imperceptible. If there was more, where would it be? The minefield outside was a constant reminder of deadly limits. They were trapped there, and resources, even the most insignificant, were precious. Ilara stood up, weariness still present, but now mixed with an energy she hadn't felt in a long time. She needed a plan, a strategy to find more of that material, or perhaps to optimize the use of what they had. The secret chamber, the place where it all began, came to her mind. Thorne's diary. Perhaps there were more clues there. The wind howled outside, a solitary sound scratching against the water tower's metal, but Ilara barely heard it. Her ears were now attuned to a different sound. The soft whisper of life sprouting, the promise of a future that, though still uncertain, felt more real than ever. The journey would be long and dangerous, but with each leaf that unfurled, with each sprout that strengthened, Ilara's hope solidified, transforming into an unwavering faith. They would cultivate that paradise, one bucket at a time if necessary. With new vitality pulsing in her veins, Ilara turned her eyes to the secret chamber. That small hole in the wall, once an accidental discovery, was now a portal to knowledge, a promise of answers. The sprouts, greener and firmer in the bucket, were silent proof that Dr. Thorne was no charlatan, but a visionary. Kyle and Leah, still marveling at the plant's growth, watched their mother with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Ilara knelt, pushing aside the piece of metal that concealed the chamber's entrance. The darkness within seemed less frightening now, less a mystery and more a vault of secrets. She lit the lantern, its yellowish light dancing over the damp walls and Dr. Thorne's few belongings. The diary, its leather-bound volume already worn by time and handling, lay exactly where she had left it. Sitting on the cold floor, with the children nestled beside her, Ilara opened the diary. The smell of old paper and mold rose into the air, mingling with the earthy aroma the seeds had brought. She turned the pages with a new purpose, ignoring descriptions of Thorne's journey and musings on the end of the world. Her eyes sought a single word, a single phrase: nutritive substrate. The lantern's light revealed Thorne's precise handwriting. Ilara read aloud, her soft voice filling the space, so that Kale and Leah, though they wouldn't understand all the words, would sense the importance of what was being discovered. Germination is only the first step, Ilara read. The full development of genetic qualities requires a specific substrate, rich in microelements and decomposed organic matter. The desert soil, impoverished by centuries of erosion and absence of life, is insufficient. My research indicated that the remnants of microbial and plant life accumulated in protected environments, such as caves or sealed structures, can serve. It's a type of virgin soil but untouched by superficial devastation. Her heart pounded harder. Sealed structures, the water tower, that was exactly it. The material she had found in the corner, dark and dense, made perfect sense. It was the accumulation of decades, perhaps centuries, of dust, spores, and organic remnants that had settled there before the water tower was completely sealed. But that's not enough, Kyle observed, his small voice filled with a wisdom that surpassed his age. We only have a little bit, Mama. Leah nodded, pointing to the bucket. For all the plants, we need more. Ilara smiled, squeezing her children's hands. You're right, my loves, and Dr. Thorne knew that. She continued to read, turning a few more pages. For large plantations, composting is essential. Using organic waste combined with desert earth can revitalize it. Plant remains, small animal droppings, even what's left of our food. Everything can be transformed into life. Ilara's eyes widened. Composition, composting. She had never thought of it in such an organized way. It had always been a matter of saving, of not wasting, but Thorne spoke of transforming, of creating. He's teaching us how to make more food for the plants, Leah murmured, her eyes shining with understanding. Exactly, my love, Ilara replied, a new plan taking shape in her mind. She had the sprouts, she had the seeds, and now she had the recipe for the soil. But composting was a time-consuming process, and they needed more substrate now for the sprouts struggling for life. She continued to read, and a final passage made her hold her breath. In case of extreme urgency, where natural substrate is scarce and composting is not yet mature, a small amount of concentrated organic matter can be found in the oldest and most protected pockets of earth. Usually in the foundations of ancient structures or in deep crevices where moisture persists, and microbial life has not been completely eradicated by sun and wind. Deep crevices. Ilara remembered the fissures at the base of the water tower. Some she had sealed with such effort against pests, others that remained open but hidden behind piles of rubble. What if there was more of that material? More of that virgin soil hidden in the deepest, darkest parts of her own refuge. The water tower, her home and her prison, revealed yet another of its secrets. The thought of exploring the dark, tight crevices where scorpions and other creatures might hide sent a shiver down Ilara's spine. But the sight of the dying sprouts, and now the image of a green future, propelled her forward. Hope, once a vibrant sun, now transformed into a fire burning in her chest, warming away fear and uncertainty. The wind outside began to howl again, a solitary lament clashing against the water tower's metal. But Ilara barely heard it. She was focused on the next step. With Thorne as her silent guide, she knew what she had to do. She needed a more suitable tool than Leah's spade. Something that could reach into the depths, something that could scrape the precious substrate from the most inaccessible places. The search wouldn't be easy, but the reward, a green and abundant world, was worth any risk. The lantern's light, still on, flickered in Ilara's hand, illuminating the metallic innards of the water tower. Her gaze scoured the floor, searching for anything that might serve. A spade was ideal, but their belongings were so few and so essential that hardly anything else would fit. Kyle and Leah, sensing their mother's urgency, began to rummage through the small piles of junk and rusted metal she had collected over the years. "What are we looking for, Mama?" Kyle asked, his voice muffled by the metal's echo. "Something long and thin, that can scrape the earth," Ilara replied, her gaze fixed on a twisted metal bar that had once been part of an internal ladder. It was heavy, but perhaps it could be adapted. She picked it up, feeling the weight and coldness of the material in her hands. Leah, with her curious eyes, pointed to a piece of broken metal rod, cast aside. "What about this, Mama?" "It's thin." Ilara looked. It was a fragment of rebar, with one end slightly flattened and sharpened by corrosion. It was perfect, lighter than the bar, and with the ideal tip for poking and scraping. She picked it up, feeling the rough texture of the rust. "Excellent, my love," she said, squeezing her daughter's hand. With the tool in hand, Ilara headed to the base of the water tower. where the metal walls met the uneven, packed earth floor. The fissures, previously perceived as mere floors to be sealed, were now portals to a hidden treasure. She switched on her headlamp, freeing her hands, and Kale and Leah stood beside her, watching with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. The air inside the water tower was heavy, laden with the smell of old metal, dust, and a hint of dampness Ilara had barely noticed before. She leaned in, pointing the light into the first crevice. It was narrow, barely allowing her hand to pass. She thrust the rusted rebar in, feeling the tip scratch against the metal and loose earth. A soft sound of tiny things moving echoed from the dark. A shiver ran up her spine. "Don't be afraid, Mama," Leah whispered, her small hand touching Ilara's arm. Ilara took a deep breath, trying to push away the image of scorpions and spiders that might be lurking. Hope was stronger than fear. She prodded deeper, feeling the tip of the rebar meet something more resistant, denser. With a careful motion, she began to scrape. A small handful of dark, damp, compacted earth fell to the floor. Ilara knelt, examining it under the lantern's light. It was darker than the desert soil, almost black, and had an earthy, sweet smell, different from what the seeds exuded, but equally promising. There it was, Thorn's virgin soil, concentrated, untouched. "This is it!" Ilara exclaimed, her voice choked with emotion. Kyle and Leah crouched beside her, their eyes wide. "Is it like the one that made the sprouts grow?" Kyle asked. "Yes, my love," she replied, already thrusting the rebar back into the crevice. Each scrape brought forth a little more of the precious substrate. She worked methodically, moving from one crevice to another, exploring the bases of the internal walls and the darker recesses where time and dampness had done their work. In a particularly hidden corner, behind a pile of twisted metal sheets, Ilara found a deeper depression, almost a small pocket. The lantern's light revealed a thick layer of dark soil, mixed with small fragments of decomposed organic matter. A strong smell of mold and earth rose, and Ilara knew she had found a significant reserve. She worked there for hours, the sound of metal scraping earth filling the silence. The children helped her, holding the small bucket where the substrate was deposited, or simply observing, their faces illuminated by the lantern's light, reflecting their mother's determination. Ilara's arm ached. Her fingers were dirty and scratched, but she didn't stop. Each handful of dark earth was a piece of the future she was building. When the bucket was almost full, Ilara's body protested, but her spirit was invigorated. She stood up, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. The sparkle in Kyle and Leah's eyes was the greatest reward. "We did it," she murmured, embracing her children. "Now we have enough to make a bigger garden." The wind outside, which had once seemed a solitary lament, now sounded like a victory chant, echoing in the water tower's metallic walls. Ilara looked at the full bucket, and then at the small sprouts, which now appeared greener and stronger under the lantern's glow. Thorn's promise, the green genesis, was no longer a distant hope. It was a tangible reality, one bucket of earth at a time. The journey would be arduous, but with each scrape of her rusted rebar, Ilara felt she was cultivating not just plants, but a new world, a green refuge in the heart of the desert. Ilara looked at the full bucket, the dark, damp treasure gleaming under the lantern's light. Fatigue tightened her muscles, but a renewed energy pulsed in her chest. Kyle and Leah, their eyes shining with a mixture of weariness and anticipation, were at her side. The sound of the wind outside, which had once seemed a lament, now almost whispered a lullaby, cradling the promise of a future. "Now, for the most delicate work," Ilara murmured, her voice soft, almost reverent. She carried the bucket to the center of the chamber, where the small, improvised containers housed the fragile sprouts. The earthy scent of the virgin soil spread through the heavy air of the water tower, an aroma of life amidst the cold metal. With a rusted spoon she used for their meager food, Ilara began to carefully transfer the dark earth into the containers. Each sprout, previously fighting for its existence in impoverished soil, now received a nourishing mantle. She worked with the precision of a surgeon, her movements slow and deliberate. Kyle and Leah's eyes followed every action, silent but intensely involved. A murmur of satisfaction escaped Ilara's lips when the last container was filled. She sprinkled a small amount of water, watching the drops mingle with the dark earth, the moisture absorbed like a thirsty sponge. The sprouts, previously pale and bent, seemed to vibrate, their minuscule leaves stretching, as if already sensing the new life that enveloped them. The green color deepened, an almost immediate sign of revitalization. "They're stronger, Mama," Leah whispered, pointing to a particularly vigorous sprout. "They are, my love," Ilara replied, a tired but genuine smile lighting her face. That small glimpse of success was the fuel she needed for the next challenges. But the truth was, those sprouts were only the beginning. To feed her family and, more importantly, to fulfill Thorne's promise of a green Genesis, they needed much more. "What now?" Kyle asked, his voice serious. "We need more light, Mama, and a place to really grow." Ilara nodded. Kyle had hit the crucial point. The water tower, though a safe refuge against the hostile desert and its nocturnal dangers, was a tomb for sunlight. The only openings were the crevices she sealed against invaders. For Thorne's plants to flourish, they needed the sun, the very sun that had turned the world into a desert. She remembered Thorne's notes, which mentioned the seed's adaptability, but even genetically enhanced plants needed light. "We'll need a greenhouse," Ilara said, more to herself than to her children. An improvised greenhouse, built with the few translucent materials she had collected. Perhaps some old acrylic pieces or reinforced plastic, but where? Inside, the water tower was too dark, and outside was the minefield, a labyrinth of silent death. The minefield. The word sent a familiar shiver down her spine. There was a small stretch of relatively flat ground near the base of the water tower, an area she had mentally mapped as less likely to contain mines. It was a risky gamble, but sunlight was non-negotiable. "We need more space and more sun," she explained to her children, pointing to the vaulted metal ceiling. "Perhaps we can open the top a little to let the light in." The idea seemed bold, almost heretical, to violate the integrity of their own shelter. But the plants' lives depended on it, and their lives ultimately depended on the plants. Kyle's eyes widened. "Open a hole in the ceiling. What about the insects?" "And the sandstorms?" Leah added, remembering the violent storms that could last for days. Ilara sighed. They were right. Opening the ceiling was inviting chaos, a greenhouse outside. The water tower was the only viable solution, but the risk of crossing the minefield to build and maintain it was immense. She couldn't risk her children. "We won't open the ceiling yet," Ilara said, trying to reassure them. "First, we'll take care of these little ones. They need a little more time to grow and get strong." She leafed through Thorne's notes again, searching for an intermediate solution for the light. The scientist had been meticulous, but he hadn't foreseen the exact conditions of her shelter. However, a sentence caught her eye, scribbled in a margin. "For low-light environments. Growth cycles can be extended, but the potency of genetic qualities may be compromised. Optimal photosynthesis requires intensity." Genetic qualities? That couldn't happen. The seeds were her only hope to repel pests, not just to provide food. Ilara stood up, walking to the wall where the metal sheet opened to reveal the exterior landscape. A circle of desolation and danger she observed cautiously each day. Daylight was beginning to filter in, drawing sharp contours in the sand. The warm air entered through the crack, bringing the smell of the desert. She remembered one of the metal panels she used to seal the larger crevices during storms. It was large enough, and if she could cut it and fix it in a way that allowed direct sunlight to pass through for a few hours a day, perhaps she could create a portable sun inside the water tower. It would be arduous and dangerous work, using noisy tools that could attract attention, but it was a risk she was willing to take to ensure the future of her sprouts. The sound of metal creaking under her hands as she inspected the panel seemed to amplify the water tower's silence. Yes, it was possible. She would need something to cut the metal, something she didn't possess. But she would do it. For her children, for Thorn, for all the lives that could emerge from this small promise. The first light of the sun began to paint the horizon a pale orange. Outside, the desert awoke with its own sounds, the rustle of dry bushes driven by the wind, the scuttling of small creatures. But inside the water tower, a new day brought a new plan, and with it, the spark of new hope. Ilara had the earth, she had the sprouts. Now, she needed to bring the sun. Sun. The word echoed in her mind like a mantra, as the faint morning light began to invade the chamber through the cracks, painting the sprouts with a pale, insufficient glow. The metal panel she had inspected leaned against the wall, a vast sheet that had once served some industrial purpose, now merely an obstacle. She touched it again, feeling the coldness of the metal beneath her fingers. Cutting it would be a monumental challenge. "Mama, are you really going to open the ceiling?" Kyle asked, his voice mixing curiosity and apprehension. Leah clung to Ilara's leg, her eyes wide. "Not the whole ceiling, my love," Ilara replied, kneeling to face them. "Just a piece, enough for the sunlight to enter a little more, but we need something to cut the metal." She had nothing but her hands, a rusted rebar, and a bent spoon. Tools for digging earth, not for piercing steel. Ilara scoured the chamber again, her eyes sweeping over every dark corner, every pile of debris. The water tower was a repository of remnants, twisted sheets, dented pipes, concrete fragments, pieces of barbed wire, nothing that resembled a cutting tool. A loud creak from outside made all three of them flinch. The wind was rising, bringing with it fine grains of sand, which struck the metal with the sound of 1,000 needles. It was the desert awakening, reminding them of the dangers that surrounded them. The noise of the wind, Ilara thought, could be a blessing. It could mask the sound of her work if she found a way to cut. She approached a pile of scrap metal in the farthest corner, where the dampness was greater and the metal more corroded. Among pieces of piping and bent beams, her fingers brushed against something heavy and oddly shaped. She pulled it out, its weight surprising her. It was a gear piece, perhaps from an old pump, made of a more resistant metal, but broken and rusted. One of its ends, where a tooth had been torn off, terminated in an irregular, sharp point, like an improvised spear. It wasn't a saw, but perhaps with effort and patience, it could be used to scrape and wear down the panel. "What is it, Mama?" Leah asked, pointing. "A tool, perhaps," Ilara murmured, her eyes shining with new hope. It was crude, heavy, and handling it would be exhausting, but it was something. With the improvised gear in hand, Ilara chose the smaller panel, which served as one of the temporary seals for a higher crevice. It was thinner and more accessible. She positioned the sharp point against the metal and began to scrape, applying all her body's strength. A shrill, sharp, metallic sound cut through the air, mingling with the wind's howl. Kyle and Leah covered their ears, but Ilara ignored the pain. She scraped and scraped, sweat streaming down her forehead. The sound was unbearable, a metallic lament that seemed to echo across the entire desert. She stopped every few minutes, listening intently. Only the wind, only the sound of the desert. She continued. Small metal flakes broke off, flying through the air before falling to the ground. Progress was agonizingly slow. The gear's point dulled, and Ilara needed to find an abrasive stone to sharpen it again, using an irregular piece of concrete she found. Hours passed. The sun climbed high in the sky, and the rays entering through the cracks became more intense, reminding her of the urgency of her work. With each scrape, a silvery thread of light seemed to emerge on the metal, a razor-thin cut that slowly deepened. Kyle, with a child's typical curiosity, watched the process, fascinated by his mother's determination. Leah slept, exhausted by the day and the intermittent noise. Finally, with a cry of effort, Ilara managed to pierce the panel. A small hole, the size of her fingernail, appeared, and through it, a single ray of sun invaded the chamber's darkness, dancing in the dusty air like a falling star. She continued, widening the cut, transforming it into a vertical slit, then into a rectangular opening. The panel became a kind of door of light, which she could adjust to allow direct sunlight to enter. When the work was almost complete, and the panel displayed an opening about 1 meter high by 30 centimeters wide, Ilara stepped back, breathless. Her arm ached, her fingers were raw, but a wide smile spread across her dirty face. She had succeeded. Carefully, she pushed the panel aside, adjusting it so that a strong golden beam of light flooded the area where the sprouts were arranged. The light, previously pale and indirect, now bathed the small plants with vibrant intensity. The sprouts, previously slightly curved, seemed to stretch, their green leaves gaining a richer, almost pulsating hue. It was as if life itself was being injected into them, a transfusion of vital energy. "Mama, they're glowing!" Kyle exclaimed, running to the sprouts, his eyes wide. Leah, who had woken up with the sudden silence, also approached, observing the small plants with admiration. The earthy smell of the virgin soil now mingled with a fresher, almost floral aroma that seemed to emanate from the revitalized leaves. Ilara knelt, feeling the sun's warmth on her face. It wasn't the greenhouse of her dreams nor perfect light, but it was a beginning, a tangible glimpse of green Genesis. The controlled entry of light, Ilara thought, was a compromise, a bridge between the water tower's safety and the vital need for the sun. She would have to move the sprouts, optimizing their exposure throughout the day, closing the opening at night to protect against invaders and sandstorms. It would be a constant dance with sun and shadows, a choreography of survival. There was still much to do. Space was limited, water scarce, and the threat of pests and the minefield persisted. But at that moment, observing the vibrant glow of the sprouts under the golden sunlight, Ilara felt a wave of gratitude. She had brought the sun. Now they needed to make it grow. The vibrant glow of the sprouts under the golden sunlight brought new energy to the chamber. Ilara felt exhausted, but the sight of those small lives stretching towards the warmth and light was a balm to her soul. The promise was palpable, but the reality of the water tower remained. They needed to grow, and Ilara knew that this growth would demand an even greater sacrifice. In the days that followed, Ilara's life transformed into an incessant dance with the sun. She woke before dawn, opening the door of light with the sunrise, adjusting the panel's angle to guide the golden rays to the sprouts. As the sun climbed, she carefully moved the containers, ensuring each plant received its vital dose of energy. The work was meticulous, the sprouts still fragile, and with each touch, Ilara felt responsibility pulse in her veins. Kyle and Leah, previously apprehensive, now approached the sprouts with reverent curiosity. They observed the slow unfurling of the leaves, the emergence of small, more robust stems. The air inside the chamber, once heavy with the smell of metal and dust, began to infuse with a gentle freshness, an earthy and slightly sweet aroma emanating from the plants. It was the smell of life, of renewed hope. However, The plant's exponential growth brought new challenges. The virgin soil at the bottom of the metal containers, though magical in its composition, needed water. Each day, the sprouts absorbed more, and the family's water reserve dwindled at an alarming rate. Ilara measured every drop with painful precision, saving even water for her own hygiene. The sound of water being poured onto the earth was a silent hymn of survival, a sound she heard with a mixture of hope and dread. "Mama, are they thirsty?" Leah asked one day, pointing to a leaf that looked a little wilted. Ilara's heart tightened. "They are, my love," she replied, wetting her fingertip and gently stroking the leaf. "But we'll give them what they need." Water was the limit, and the water tower, once a safe haven, began to become a cage. The sprouts, which once fit in a small corner, now spread out, their roots deepening and their leaves stretching, demanding more space, more light, and incessantly more water. Ilara saw the containers becoming too small, the plants competing for every ray of sun that managed to enter. The opening in the metal panel, so arduously won, was a blessing, but also a weakness. During the day, the sun's heat entered, warming the chamber to the point of making it stifling. At night, the cold sand wind seeped in, and Ilara needed to carefully close the door of light, sealing it with cloths and loose metal pieces to prevent the entry of rodents and insects that the darkness invited. The sound of sand beating against the water tower's metal was a constant reminder of the fragility of their security. One night, while observing the sprouts under the faint light of a lantern, Ilara leafed through Thorne's notes again. The scientist had detailed growth cycles, humidity, and light requirements, and in a later paragraph, a sentence she had previously ignored gained a new and terrifying meaning. For the genetic qualities of repelling pests and thriving in arid soil to reach their maximum potential, the plants must be cultivated in an open area, with full exposure to sun and air, allowing the dispersion of their volatile compounds into the environment. Open, full exposure. The meaning was clear. The plants couldn't live forever inside the water tower. Their cure for the earth, their protection against pests, wouldn't be achieved if they remained confined. Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. The greenhouse outside. The water tower was inevitable. The minefield, the silent and deadly threat surrounding her makeshift home, seemed to loom larger in Ilara's mind. Building and maintaining a greenhouse out there meant traversing the forbidden area, exposing herself to the danger of every uncertain step. But the sprouts' success, their vibrant growth, ignited a new flame of determination. They had survived the desert. They had transformed darkness into light. Now they needed to expand that light. The next day, as the sprouts stretched towards the sunbeam, Ilara watched Kale and Leah playing in a corner, their laughter echoing on the metal. Her decision was made. She needed to go outside. She needed to build the greenhouse. The minefield remained, but the hope sprouting from those seeds was greater than any fear. It was time to draw a new map, one that led beyond the water tower's safety to the earth waiting to be healed. Ilara had the seeds, she had the sprouts. Now she needed to face the desert. Ilara felt the sweet, fresh scent of the plants intensify in the air, almost an invitation to the outside world. The decision to take the sprouts out of the water tower to the thirsty earth was overwhelming, but the sight of life stretching towards the light propelled her. She knew the task was monumental, perhaps suicidal, but the fate of her children and the land was at stake. The next morning, Kyle and Leah found her bent over the metal floor, no longer over the sprouts, but sketching in the dust with a makeshift piece of charcoal. The map in her mind took shape, a tangle of lines and symbols that only she understood. "What are you doing, Mama?" Leah asked, her curious eyes fixed on the drawings. "I'm drawing our future, my love," Ilara replied, without taking her eyes off the floor. "We need a place for the plants to grow, a place out there where the sun and wind can reach them freely. Kyle, with his keen perception of danger, approached cautiously. But the minefield? The question echoed in the chamber's silence, a chilling reminder of the invisible threat. Ilara pressed her lips together. "We'll find a way, your father. He knew a lot about this area. He told me about the markers, about the patterns." She paused, her voice choked with memory. Her husband, before he left, had mentioned that the field wasn't entirely random, that there were traces of old patrol routes. It was a tenuous, almost non-existent hope, but it was all she had. She leafed through Thorne's notes again. The scientist had included a rudimentary sketch of a field greenhouse, a minimalist design that utilized scrap and found materials. It was a skeleton, a structure to be covered with anything that could retain heat and light. Plastic, fabric, thin metal. The water tower offered metal, but cutting and shaping it would be a Herculean task, besides the danger of weakening their shelter. The tool she had used to open the panel was on her makeshift belt, heavy and crude. It could be useful for digging, for testing the soil, but not for disarming or detecting. The sound of the wind outside, howling against the water tower's metal, seemed to mock her plans. Ilara spent the next few days in a state of feverish concentration. She divided tasks between caring for the sprouts and planning their departure. Kyle and Leah helped her move the containers, water the plants with the last drops of water, and seal the opening at night. They felt the tension in the air, the weight of the new undertaking. The first step was to find a safe path. Ilara decided she needed a long rod, something to probe the ground ahead. She found a piece of rusted rebar, which had been used to brace a part of the water tower's internal structure. It was heavy and irregular, but it had the necessary length. With the rebar in hand, Ilara approached the opening she had created. The sun scorched the desert outside, dunes stretching infinitely under a relentless blue sky. She could feel the heat radiating through the hole. The plants needed it. "Stay here, my loves. Don't stray from the sprouts," she instructed Kyle and Leah, who watched her with wide eyes. The silence that followed her voice was broken only by the faint rustle of the sprouts' leaves and the distant sound of the wind, a low, continuous lament. With her heart pounding in her chest, Ilara pushed the panel, opening the door of light, wider than usual, creating a gap wide enough for her to pass through. She felt the smell of hot sand, dry air, and danger. It was a smell that had accompanied her since her husband's death, but now it was stronger, more imminent. She squeezed out, feeling the sun burn her skin. Her eyes adjusted to the light's intensity. The world outside was a sea of sand and rocks, dotted with twisted metal remnants and debris that the wind had scattered. Somewhere there, death lurked beneath the surface. With the rebar extended in front of her, Ilara began to probe the ground. Each movement was slow, deliberate. The sound of metal hitting the sand, a whisper that seemed amplified by the desert's oppressive silence. She remembered what her husband used to say about looking for patterns, about areas that seemed cleaner, less disturbed. She advanced one step, then another, the rebar testing the terrain with a surgeon's delicacy. The metal creaked with each contact, sending vibrations up the rod to her hands. Sweat streamed down her face, mixing with the dust. With each successful test, a temporary relief, but the tension never diminished. The danger was invisible, a silent trap beneath the sand. The water tower, once a cage, now seemed a beacon of safety amidst an ocean of danger. She looked back, seeing Kyle and Leah's faces, small silhouettes in the opening's darkness, their eyes fixed on her. Courage was not the absence of fear, Ilara knew, but the ability to act despite it. And she would act. She would create a path. The sound of the rebar hitting the sand was the rhythm of her determination, a hymn of defiance to the desert. She needed a place for green genesis. She needed a path. With each strike, the fine sand scattered, revealing the dry, compacted earth beneath. Sweat streamed down Ilara's forehead, salty and stinging in her eyes. She moved in an almost meditative rhythm, one step, one probe, another step. The sun's heat was relentless, baking the desert in a silent oven. Occasionally, an insect buzzed irritably near her ear, but her focus was unwavering. She remembered her husband's words, echoing in her mind like a whisper from the past. They didn't just scatter things everywhere, Ilara. There was logic. There were service routes. Look for the lines, the deviations, the places that seem less broken. The phrase "less broken" seemed absurdly poetic for a minefield, but Ilara clung to it. She searched for any sign of order in the apparent chaos. The rebar scraped against something hard. Ilara's heart leaped, her breath caught in her throat. She recoiled slightly, the metal still touching the object. With her fingertips, she began to scrape away the sand. It wasn't a rock. It was a piece of concrete, almost completely buried, with a strange shape. She continued to dig with her hands, revealing a series of smaller concrete blocks arranged in an irregular line. They weren't natural, they were markers. A wave of relief and a pang of terror hit her. Her husband was right. There was a pattern. But following these markers meant trusting the memory of a dead man and the precision of ancient engineers who had vanished decades ago. Ilara knelt, examining the markers. They stretched in a straight line for about 20 meters, before disappearing again under the thicker sand. She looked back at the water tower. Kyle and Leah were just dark specks in the opening, but she could feel their gazes. She needed to continue. With renewed caution, she followed the invisible line of markers, using the rebar to probe every inch of soil between them. The sound of metal hitting the sand was now that of a dangerous melody, each note a test of life or death. She found a few more blocks, some almost disintegrated but still recognizable. Suddenly, about 50 meters from the water tower, the line of markers seemed to end in a natural depression in the terrain, where a cluster of rocks and some twisted metal pieces formed a small barrier. The spot seemed slightly more protected from the wind, and the soil, though sandy, appeared less disturbed. This was it. This would be the place for the greenhouse. Ilara moved towards the depression, the rebar sweeping the ground with heightened attention. She felt a stronger scrape. She stopped, tore at the sand. A thin, rusted metal plate was almost completely covered. She unearthed it with difficulty. It was part of an old solar panel, broken and useless for generating power, but large and flat, perfect for a wall, or perhaps even the greenhouse roof. The desert was providing its own materials. "Mama!" Kyle's voice echoed, faint but clear, carrying worry. Ilara looked back. Kyle pointed to the sun, which was beginning to descend on the horizon, tinging the sky orange and purple. Night was approaching. Time was running out. Ilara waved to him, an exhausted smile on her face. She had found the path and the location. Now she needed materials. She scoured the area around the depression, finding more pieces of metal, some smaller rebars, and even a piece of thick canvas, semi-buried and torn at one end, but still usable. It was as if the desert, in its cruelty, was offering small crumbs of hope. The light faded quickly, and the air, previously scorching, began to cool, bringing with it the howl of the night wind. The dangers of the night were different from those of the day, but no less threatening. Rodents, larger insects, the penetrating cold. She couldn't stay any longer. With her hands full of her first finds, the metal plate, some rebars, and the canvas, Ilara began to retrace her path, carefully repeating each of her steps. The weight of the materials was a burden, but also a tangible reminder of her progress. The sound of the wind now carried the rustle of the sprout's leaves inside the water tower, almost a call. She made her way back to the relative safety of the water tower, exhausted, but with a new spark of hope shining in her eyes. Leah ran to hug her, her small arms wrapped tightly around her mother's legs. Kyle helped her unload the materials, his eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and admiration. Ilara knew the greenhouse wouldn't be built in a single night, but she had the path, she had the location, and she had the first materials. The sun had set, plunging the desert into a starry darkness, but inside the water tower, under the faint lantern light, the green Genesis sprouts seemed to glow with an even more intense promise. The battle was just beginning, but the first victory had been won, one step at a time, in the heart of the minefield. Ilara slid the piece of canvas onto the metal floor, the rough fabric scraping against the rust. Beside her, the solar panel plate tumbled with a dull thud, and the rebars settled with a metallic clink. Leah nestled against her mother, the weariness of waiting and the emotion of reunion weighing in her eyes. Kyle, older and with a growing sense of responsibility, examined the findings with curiosity. "These are good materials, Mama," he said, tracing the panel's rusted surface. Ilara nodded, a faint smile spreading across her dusty face. "They are, my love. The desert has given us a gift." She lit the improvised lamp, and its flickering light danced over the objects and her children's faces. The green Genesis sprouts within their containers seemed to stretch towards the faint luminosity, a vibrant green contrasting with the somber metal. That night, under the water tower's protection, Ilara drew a plan. Using a piece of charcoal and the tank's inner wall, she sketched the greenhouse structure. The natural depression would be the foundation. The rocks and twisted metal pieces would form the base of the walls. The solar panel plate could be part of the roof, reflecting excessive heat, or one of the side walls, depending on the need for light. The canvas, even torn, would be vital for protection and shading. The rebars, bent and tied, would be the skeletal structure. Kale and Leah watched her in silence, occasionally asking questions about how she would join the pieces or how the sprouts would adjust there. Ilara explained patiently, feeling a heavy burden, but also a new clarity in her mind. The path was laid out. The vision was clear. Dawn brought with it a new cycle of relentless heat and growing urgency. The sprouts had visibly grown overnight, their small leaves unfurling as if propelled by an invisible force. Ilara knew she couldn't delay. With a new set of tools, her crude hammer, a sharp piece of metal for digging, and the probing rebar, she prepared for her next journey. "Kyle, Leah, keep looking after green Genesis. Keep the opening closed, but allow a little light in when the sun is weaker. And keep an eye out for any movement outside," she instructed, her voice firm. The metal gate creaked as she pushed it open, revealing the sea of sand under a cloudless sky. The hot air enveloped her instantly, and the smell of dust and burnt metal filled her nostrils. She followed the concrete markers she had discovered the day before, each step measured and cautious. The rebar struck the sand, the sound hollow and constant, a warning and a promise. Upon reaching the depression, the chosen site for the greenhouse, Ilara began to work. First, she cleared the area. With her hands and the sharp piece of metal, she removed loose sand and smaller rocks, creating a flatter surface. Sweat streamed in rivulets, blurring her vision, but she didn't stop. The sun punished her neck, and the hot sand burned through the soles of her boots. She then began to position the larger rocks and twisted metal pieces, forming a perimeter for the greenhouse's base. Each piece was heavy, requiring considerable effort. The metal scraped against the rocks, a shrill sound that seemed to echo in the desert's silence. She lifted the solar panel plate, dragging it with difficulty to the spot. The plate's smooth, cold surface, despite being rusted, would offer a solid barrier against wind and sand. As she worked, a dry, sharp crack broke the silence. Ilara froze, her heart leaping. She looked around, her eyes searching for the sound's source. It was a small dry bush, its thin branches snapping as they broke under the strong wind that was beginning to pick up. A shiver ran down her spine. The desert was relentless, and every sound, every unexpected movement, was a constant reminder of the death that lay hidden beneath the surface. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the tremor in her hands. It wasn't a mine, not this time. But the warning was there. Danger was a constant companion. She continued to work, now with an even greater sense of urgency. Her movements faster, more determined. Every rock she moved, every rebar she positioned was an act of faith, a brick in the foundation of a future that still seemed distant, but now had a more defined outline. The sun began its descent, and the water tower, far away, called her back, a beacon of hope amidst the hostile desert. The heat burned her muscles. The water tower, far away, was a point of light, but the greenhouse was the promise of life. She had to push forward. With renewed breath, she picked up one of the smaller rebars, trying to bend it with her hands. The metal yielded only slightly, creaking. She retrieved her crude hammer, forged from a twisted piece of iron and a wooden handle. With calculated blows, the sound of metal striking metal, echoing dryly in the thin air, she began to shape the rebar into an angle. It was slow, painful work, each impact sending a vibration through her arms. She needed something to tie the pieces together. Rope was a luxury, but perhaps there were metal wires somewhere. Her eyes swept the depression again, searching for anything that might serve. Among the rocks, half buried in the sand, she saw a tangle of thin, rusted wires. It was a piece of fence, or perhaps control cables from some ancient machine, but the wires, though thin, were strong. With a sharp metal tip, she began to unearth them, carefully pulling the metallic web. The rustle of the wires as they were dragged through the dry sand was the only sound, besides her ragged breath. She managed to get a good length, wrapping it around her wrist. With the wires in hand, Ilara began to fasten the rebars she had shaped to the rocks and twisted metal pieces that formed the base. She twisted the wires with her calloused fingers, feeling the roughness of the metal against her skin. Each knot, each connection, was a test of her strength and determination. The skeletal structure of the greenhouse began to emerge from the ground, a promise amidst the chaos. The wind picked up, whistling through the newly erected rebars, creating a ghostly lament. Sand whipped at her face, and she could feel the grains accumulating in her hair and clothes. Kyle was at the opening, waving frantically. The sun almost touched the horizon. She could no longer ignore the call of night. The invisible threats of the minefield at night were too great to face alone. With a sigh of frustration and a last look at the rudimentary structure she had begun to erect, Ilara gathered a few more pieces of wire and a small metal plate she found nearby. The weight of the materials was a comfort, a sign that her work was not in vain. Retracing her steps with her usual caution, she navigated back along the marked path, the rebar probing the ground ahead. Twilight transformed the desert into a sea of distorted shadows, and every mark on the ground seemed to blend with the growing darkness. The metallic clink of the rebar was now more a guide in the gloom than a warning sound. When the water tower's gate creaked shut behind her, the relief that flooded her was almost physical. Leah ran to her, hugging her legs, and Kale quickly helped unload the materials. Their faces, illuminated by the lamp, showed the weariness of waiting and the anxiety for progress. "Mama, did you get more?" Leah asked, her big eyes fixed on the wire strands. "Yes, my love. Wires to tie the walls and another plate for the roof," Ilara replied, her voice hoarse with dust and exhaustion. "Tomorrow the greenhouse will take shape." That night, while swarms of nocturnal insects buzzed and scratched at the metal outside, and rodents made their furtive noises, the family huddled together. Ilara explained the next steps, using the piece of charcoal to refine the drawings on the wall. She showed how the wires would be used to fasten the walls, how the canvas would be stretched to offer shade, and how the second metal plate could cover a critical opening. The green Genesis sprouts under the faint light seemed to have doubled in size, their lush leaves swaying gently with the internal breeze. Time was running out, and the promise of life they carried was increasingly palpable. The next dawn brought an even more intense heat. The sand outside already radiated warmth, and the air inside the water tower was stifling. Ilara bid her children farewell with the same instructions as always, her heart heavy with worry but driven by urgency. Upon reaching the depression, she saw what she had built the day before, a rudimentary structure of rocks and rebars, now more visible under the strong sunlight. The wire strands she had placed seemed small, but they were the foundation of her hope. She began to work immediately, the hammer in one hand, the wires in the other. She connected more rebars, hammering them into the rock crevices, bending them at angles that would support the walls. The sound of metal against rock, metal against metal, was constant. A symphony of construction in the desert's oppressive silence. She used the wire strands to create tight loops, joining the rebars into a more cohesive structure. Each twist of wire demanded strength, and her hands were raw, but she persisted. Slowly, the greenhouse walls began to rise. Ilara dragged the thick canvas she had found, positioning it over a section of the rebars. The fabric, rough and dusty, would offer vital shade for the delicate sprouts. She used more wire to fasten the canvas to the structure, stretching it as much as possible to maximize the shaded area. The sun was now directly overhead, its glare almost unbearable. Drops of sweat streamed from her face, mixing with dust and salt. Her throat was dry, and thirst was a constant agony. She took a brief pause, emptying the last drop of water from her improvised canteen, feeling the warm liquid descend her throat. She couldn't stop. As she tried to lift one of the rusted metal plates to serve as a side wall, her feet slipped on the loose sand. The heavy metal tumbled with a deafening crash, raising a cloud of dust. The sound echoed, startling a flock of birds flying high, sending them scattering. Ilara fell to her knees, her heart pounding in her chest. The thud of the metal had made her think the worst, of a mine, of death. But it was just the panel. She stood up, shaking the sand from her clothes, the anger at her own mistake, and the momentary fear mingling into a new wave of determination. She pushed the metal plate with her back, using brute force to set it upright, leaning against the rebars. With wire strands and a hammer, she fastened it firmly. The greenhouse now had a solid wall, a defined shape. The metal and canvas walls, supported by the rebars, created a rectangular space, still open at the top and on one side, but undeniably a structure. The vibrant green of the sprouts, which she had left inside the water tower, seemed to pull at her, insisting that their new home be completed. The sun began to dip again, its orange glow painting the sky. Ilara stepped back a few paces, breathless, to admire her work. It was rudimentary, yes, but it was a greenhouse, a base, partial walls, and the roof still to come. It wasn't ready to receive the sprouts, but it was much closer. The wind, softer now, made the canvas rustle gently, like a hymn of encouragement. Tomorrow, she would bring the rest of the roof and perhaps the first sprouts to their new home. Hope was a fire that burned, growing stronger with every brick of metal and wire. The new day dawned, painting the desert in fiery orange and soft rose hues, a stark contrast to the exhaustive work that awaited Ilara. She felt a deep weariness in her bones. But the sight of the water tower, a distant silhouette against the rising sun, propelled her forward. Inside, the green Genesis seedlings pulsed with a silent, insistent life, their emerald leaves vibrant even in the dim light. They waited. With renewed determination, Ilara navigated the familiar and treacherous path back to the depression. The skeletal structure of the greenhouse stood proudly, a monument to her relentless effort. Today, it would be complete. The first task was the roof. She dragged the last and largest metal plate into position, its rusted surface scraping against the rebar with a metallic screech that grated in the morning silence. With her improvised hammer, she drove the last rebars into place, the dry, resonant blows echoing across the desolate landscape. Each impact reverberated through her arms, but she barely noticed the pain. Using the wire strands she had found, she twisted them tightly, securing the plate and ensuring it would withstand the desert's furious winds. The remaining canvas was then stretched over the open sections, fastened with more wire, creating a patchwork of shade that promised relief from the scorching sun. The greenhouse was finished. It was rudimentary, a testament to desperation and ingenuity, but it was a shelter, a sanctuary for life. Her heart pounded with a mixture of exhaustion and exultant triumph as she returned to the water tower. Kyle and Leah were already awake, their faces lit by anticipation. "Mama, is it ready?" Leah whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "Yes, my loves. It's ready," Ilara replied, her voice choked with emotion. "Now it's time to bring life into it." With the utmost care, Ilara began to transfer the precious seedlings. Each pot, heavy with nutrient-rich soil, was cradled in her hands as if it were spun glass. Kyle, with surprising strength for his age, helped carry some of the smaller ones, his steps slow and deliberate as he followed his mother's precise path. Leah walked beside them, her small hand clutching Ilara's shirt, her eyes wide, absorbing every detail of that memorable journey. The rustle of the leaves as they moved was the only sound, a soft whisper of a new beginning. Inside the greenhouse, the air was fresher, a blessed relief from the desert heat. Filtered sunlight painted soft patterns on the soil, illuminating the prepared rows. Ilara knelt, her knees sinking into the soft earth she had meticulously loosened. One by one, with reverence, she carefully transplanted each seedling, gently separating the roots and settling them into their new home. When the last seedling found its place, a profound silence hung over them, broken only by the soft sigh of the wind outside. A new sound, no longer a lament, but a gentle lullaby. Ilara stepped back, her children on either side, their hands clasped in hers. Before them, rows of vibrant green pulsed with a silent strength. The air inside the greenhouse began to fill with a subtle, earthy fragrance, a sweet counterpoint to the desert's arid smell. Even as the sun began its descent, painting the greenhouse walls in long, shifting shadows, there was no sound of buzzing insects, no furtive scratching of rodents against the metal and canvas. The promise of the seeds, genetically modified to repel pests, seemed to manifest instantly, enveloping the greenhouse in an invisible shield. A tear traced a path through the dust on Ilara's face. "They are safe here," she murmured, her voice choked with gratitude. "They will grow. They will feed us." Kyle looked at her, a rare smile gracing his young face. "They're beautiful, Mama." Leah, her eyes reflecting the emerald gleam of the plants, extended a small finger, almost touching a soft leaf. "Our new home," she whispered. Ilara pulled her children close, hugging them tightly amidst the nascent garden. The water tower had been their fortress, their temporary refuge from a hostile world. But this greenhouse, born of her perseverance and the miraculous seeds, was more than a shelter. It was the future. It was the healing of their land, the end of their suffering. The desert was still vast and dangerous, but within these humble walls, life had not only found a way, it had blossomed, a testament to a mother's unbreakable will and the enduring power of hope. The outside world could roar, but here, within their green sanctuary, a new story was just beginning to take root.